You're very welcome to the FCC. My name is Enda Curran. I'm a correspondent governor here at the FCC. Today's lunch is priced out of paradise, and we are delighted to welcome back Mr. Christopher Dillon, who is an author and principal of Dillon Communications and has a long history with the club. Christopher will describe in his talk strategies for surviving Hong Kong's hyper-expensive residential property market. A Canadian native, he's been a member of our club since 1992, and along the way in 2002 he bought and renovated a floor in an office building in Central. Since then he has purchased and refurbished a luxury apartment on the west side of Hong Kong Island and transformed a derelict steam laundry into a multimedia studio. He began investing in Japanese real estate in 2010 and has served on the management committee of a 210-unit apartment complex since 2012. That experience has inspired 4 books from Chris: Landed Hong Kong, Landed Japan, Landed China, and Landed Global, with information and examples from more than 110 countries. A new edition of Landed Japan was released in March. So to talk us through being priced out of paradise, would you please welcome Mr. Christopher Dillon.
Thank you for that warm introduction. In March of 2018, a 209 square foot apartment in this unfinished building in Pak Phalam on the west side of Hong Kong Island sold for a cool $1 million US. At 209 square feet, the apartment was about 1/3 larger than a standard 20-foot shipping container like the one shown on the right in this picture. That, I think you will agree, is an astonishing amount of money for a home in a nice but not terribly exclusive neighborhood. And record-breaking sales like that in Hong Kong are very common. Earlier this month, the parking space changed here for 6 million Hong Kong dollars, or 760,000 US. Transactions like these are responsible for Hong Kong's ranking in the world as the world's least affordable city for residential real estate in the 2017 Demographia Survey. With a median multiple of 19.4, Hong Kong is expensive, but Hong Kong is not alone. Demographia's top 10 includes Sydney, Vancouver, San Francisco, Auckland, and London. And other cities in the top 25 include Toronto at 11, Seattle at 19, and New York, strangely enough, at 22. So what can you do if you live in Hong Kong or another hyper-expensive city? You want to buy a home, but you're priced out of the market. In the presentation that follows, I'll give 3 possible solutions to that: defining the problem, substitution, and looking further afield. I'll also give you some tools to evaluate your options, avoid common mistakes, and hopefully make better decisions. The first solution is to define the problem. And it's easy to say that homes in your city are too expensive, but what exactly does too expensive mean? For example, does the $1 million apartment that I mentioned a minute ago, would that represent good value at $500,000 or $250,000? Or are you like the guy in this picture who's basically never going to be able to afford anything in Hong Kong? To define the problem, you need to understand your city's housing stock and its price history, as well as your ability to get and service a mortgage. Websites operated by local real estate agents and by the government will give you a lot of the market data, and your bank will be more than happy to tell you how much they will lend you. With this reality check, you could discover that you simply can't afford a home in Hong Kong. More on that in a moment. But you could also learn that by changing your buying criteria, such as the home's size, its location, or its age, you could afford to buy. Or you could find that everything would be perfect if you found a bargain, or if the market went into free fall and dropped 25%. I've lived through 4 major corrections in 3 frothy property markets: Calgary, Canada in the 1980s, Tokyo in the early 1990s, and here in Hong Kong in 1997 after the Asian financial crisis, and 5 years later during SARS. In all 4 of these downturns, buyers waiting on the sidelines were delighted to see property prices drop. But each market correction was sparked by bad news, and each one played out very differently. In Calgary, which is Canada's oil and gas capital, interest rates topped an eye-watering 21% in late 1981. The previous year, the federal government introduced the much-hated National Energy Program, which hammered the local energy industry. Home prices in parts of Calgary dropped by 40%, and that's almost unheard of in a developed economy like Canada. It took years for Calgary to rebound. In Tokyo, the correction was part of a larger economic collapse, and it's taken more than 20 years for Tokyo prices to start to rebound. New condominium prices in Tokyo are now still below the records that were set in 1990. Today, in resort towns outside of Tokyo, you can buy a perfectly livable condominium for 1 million yen, or 10,000 US dollars. Here in Hong Kong, the Asian financial crisis caused some home prices in some parts of the city to drop by 2/3 basically overnight. SARS claimed almost 300 lives and extended the misery, and there was another small drop during the global financial crisis. Hong Kong people who were waiting to buy chased prices on the way up and then worried about overpaying all the way down. However, prices continued to rise. There are three takeaways here. First, the timing and the duration of market corrections is really difficult to predict. In the immortal words of economist John Maynard Keynes, the market can stay irrational far longer than you can stay solvent. Second, it's very easy to talk about buying in a downturn, but it takes guts, real courage to get a checkbook out when the market is falling. Third, knowing what constitutes fair value, both for you personally, your budget, and from a historical perspective, makes it far easier to recognize it a bargain and to get your checkbook out and buy during that downturn. But what happens if you're in an expensive city and you want to buy because you think property prices are going to rise, but you simply can't afford to find a place that you'd want to live in? Well, I recommend considering a substitute. Starting with physical property, you can buy a less expensive dwelling and rent it out. And usually that means a smaller, older home, or a dwelling in a less desirable location, or for that matter, one that needs repairs. In some cities, commercial or industrial real estate is an option. Here in Hong Kong, there's a thriving market for car park spaces, and believe it or not, even motorcycle parking spaces. This is a proven way to obtain exposure to your local property market, but there are drawbacks. First, within any given city, luxury property behaves very differently from mass market homes. And residential property differs again from commercial and industrial. So it's not a perfect hedge. Second, for rental properties, mortgage rates are generally higher, and the loan-to-value ratio, which is the amount of money you can borrow as a proportion of the property's price, is lower than when you're buying a home for your own use. You'll also need to deal with tenants or pay an agent to do that for you, and don't forget about maintenance and repairs. Finally, while taxes here in Hong Kong are pretty reasonable, in Canada, so-called amateur landlords face taxes on their rental income that's about the same as what they would pay on salaries, and that's not such a good deal. Another way to gain exposure to a specific real estate market is through financial instruments such as real estate investment trusts. REITs are companies that own income-producing real estate and distribute the income to shareholders, usually in a very tax-efficient manner. Many REITs are listed on stock exchanges, and they give you the advantages of liquidity with attractive yields. REITs also allow you to invest in everything from a diversified global portfolio that holds real estate all over the world to very narrow sectors like hospitals in the United States, offices in Hong Kong, or shopping malls in China. And unlike a home, your holding in a REIT can be subdivided. You can buy or sell 100 shares at a time. Real estate-based unit trusts and mutual funds are another option, and you can also buy shares in real estate companies. This includes developers, mortgage-issuing banks, hotel chains, builders, component manufacturers, and more. Individual shares are a granular way to invest, one that exposes you to higher levels of risk and potentially reward. Financial instruments also lack the warm, fuzzy feeling, as well as the tax and maintenance bills that come with owning bricks and mortar. But they're liquid, they're subdividable, and they're also portable. But what happens if none of these opportunities scratches your real estate itch? Well, then maybe it's time to look at a different province, a different state, or maybe even a different country. But before you call your travel agent, you need to ask, why am I doing this? That's because the ideal residence, source of rental income, or retirement or vacation home each has a very different characteristic. There's no one perfect property that meets all of these objectives. For example, the home that offers the best rental yields almost never is one that you're going to want to live in. That's where the phrase slumlord comes from. Having a clear goal, whether that's earning income, achieving capital gains, or having a retreat for your family, increases the likelihood that your purchase is going to be successful in the long term. Sometimes, something that the real estate people won't tell you, renting and investing offers the best combination of liquidity, flexibility, and value. But if you're going to buy, there's a few things that you should know. Let's start with the basics. Can an individual actually own land? In Hong Kong, for example, all of the land is owned by the government except the dirt underneath this cathedral in Central. You can own a building, but only the government can own land. China is similar. The state and agricultural collectives own all of the land. Owning a building can be a wonderful thing, but owning land is almost always better. That's called freehold. Land doesn't depreciate like a building does, and owning land gives you more security, and it also gives you more opportunities to use, to exploit, and develop the property. Next, can somebody with your passport or passports own property? In Thailand, for example, if you're not a Thai national, you cannot own land. You can own a building, but not the land underneath it. The same holds true for the Philippines. In Australia, foreigners can own new properties and buy new properties, but unless they have special government approval, they're not allowed to buy existing homes. For many years, foreign buyers and local agents ignored this rule, but the Australian authorities have gotten tough in the last year and actually started unwinding transactions, which is something nobody thought they would ever see. New Zealand, incidentally, has proposed similar legislation. Even if your passport is completely in order, in some Chinese cities, for example, you have to establish residency and pay local taxes for several years before you're allowed to buy. This is one reason, incidentally, why fake marriages are quite common in China. If foreigners can buy, there may be extra taxes. Here in Hong Kong, for example, if you will pay a higher rate of stamp duty if you're not a permanent resident. In Singapore, the rate of additional buyer's stamp duty ranges from 0 for a Singaporean citizen buying her first or second home to 5% for a permanent resident buying a first home to an eye-watering 15% for a foreigner buying any residential property. And incidentally, that's on top of a buyer's stamp duty that ranges from 1% to 4% that everybody is forced to pay. Interestingly, for a nation with a reputation for xenophobia, Japan compares very favorably to other countries in this regard. With a few exceptions, there are no restrictions on foreigners owning Japanese land, and when foreigners buy, they pay the same tax rate as Japanese citizens do. In some places, there are post-acquisition taxes on foreigners. For example, Vancouver has an empty homes tax for owners who do not rent out or use their property on a full-time basis. Taxes like these can make a pied-à-terre that you only use a couple of times a year unaffordable or simply impractical. Toronto is now considering a similar tax. In some countries, vendors will try and get around local ownership restrictions by using nominees or holding companies. And these approaches may, in fact, be legal, and sometimes they can protect your interests. But if you're attempting to evade the spirit of a law, you can find yourself in deep trouble. And as a matter of practice, courts rarely will uphold a contract that was designed to break or to evade a law. So if you can't own the land, you may be able to lease it. My home is built on land that was leased from the British Crown in the 1800s for a period of 999 years. And that lease, which survived the change in Hong Kong sovereignty in 1997, is effectively freehold ownership because it will survive me and my family. Short-term leases, on the other hand, like the 35 to 70-year leases that are common in places like Indonesia and China, can be a problem. The lease may be renewed when it expires. Real estate agents in places like Indonesia will often issue guarantees and tell you that it definitely will be, but they're talking through their hat. And if it is renewed, you have no idea how much it will cost or how long the term will be. Also, the value of property on leased land declines as you approach the end of the lease, and it can be very difficult to obtain a lease or a mortgage, I should say, for a home built on leased land because it offers the bank less security. So in summary, you need to determine what you can own and know what you're buying, whether that's a building or a building with land. Once you've determined what and where you can buy, you're going to need to pay for it. And this is an area where residency can make a huge difference. For example, if you live in the UK and you're a UK national, it's not at all unusual to get a mortgage in France for a home in France. But if you're living here in Hong Kong and you want to buy a home in Japan as a non-resident, good luck. The banks really don't have much time for you. So check around before you commit to anything. Countries also have different regulations that shape their mortgage markets. In the United States, you can get a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, and that's very, very common. Japan actually offers 35-year fixed-rate mortgages. In Canada, the longest you're going to get is 5 years. And also, there are a lot more variations on mortgages. In many places, you can get things like interest-only mortgages, buy-to-let, and balloon payment mortgages, where those forms of lending are outlawed in other markets. As property markets became more frothy, regulators have gradually tightened a lot of the lending rules. So, for example, now in Canada, borrowers must demonstrate that they can repay a mortgage based on an interest rate that's 200 basis points or 2 full percentage points over the actual lending rates. So that means that if you've got a mortgage for 3%, you've got to be able to prove that you can pay it back with interest rates at 5%. If you borrow across borders, you should expect to pay a higher interest rate than a local and have a lower loan-to-value ratio and also a shorter loan term. If you're an entrepreneur, a commissioned salesperson, or anybody whose income is unpredictable, you should expect a fairly cool reception at the bank. Your lack of stable income is not going to get you a warm reception. In general, the more money you bring to the table and the less you need to borrow, the more receptive the bank is going to be. Paying cash can be a very smart move because cash allows you to move quickly, particularly if you want to buy a home from a motivated seller, and that's because your offer is not going to be conditional on arranging financing. But if you are bringing cash across borders, make sure that it's properly documented and declared, or you may have trouble repatriating your funds when you sell your home. This is a very common problem in China, where people brought the money in without proper paperwork. You should also consider the legal environment of the jurisdiction where you're buying. Whether the country uses civil law, common law, or a hybrid, it's essential that the legal system is transparent, that contracts can be enforced, and that you're not discriminated against as a foreigner. That's one reason why places like Canada, Australia, the UK, and the United States have property prices that are higher than a lot of other jurisdictions. Off-the-plan purchases offer a unique set of challenges. Every weekend, unfinished developments in cities like London and Bangkok are sold in hotel function rooms here in Hong Kong, Singapore, and many other cities around the world. And these off-the-plan projects can offer advantages. You can get in, quote-unquote, on the ground floor and get a discount on the property that you're buying. However, these projects have several major risks, including late or unfinished delivery, bankrupt developers, defective design and construction, limited regulatory oversight. Here in Hong Kong, for instance, you don't need a local real estate agent's license to sell overseas property. Buying from a reputable agent who is representing an established builder is a very good place to start. It's also a good idea to know what your legal rights are, particularly if the property is in a developing country. If you're buying a home in a country where English is not the local language, the sale and purchase agreement will be in another language, whether that's German, French, or Japanese. And in general, English language translations that you might get from the developer or from the agent are not legally enforceable. So make sure that you understand what you're signing before you sign it. Those translations are very often just provided as a convenience, and they have no legal standing at all. If you're planning on living in your new home, you might want to check to make sure that your lifestyle isn't an issue. For example, if you're gay or if you enjoy smoking cannabis, Vancouver or San Francisco might be a better choice than Singapore, which has strict anti-drug laws, or Malaysia, where gay sex remains illegal. Speaking of lifestyles, before buying a place that you're going to live in, even part-time, spend some time in the area to ensure that you really like the weather and the amenities. Rent for a couple of weeks in the summer, or spend a couple of weekends there at different times of the year so that you can get past the marketing hype and really find out if the place is where you want to stay. Countries like Japan are actively courting foreigners and encouraging them to buy property. But parts of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are far less welcoming to people who buy homes and then leave the country. Foreign buyers, you should know, are often perceived by legislators as being rich and politically powerless, and that makes them very attractive targets for new taxes and for regulations. Finally, in 2002, then United States Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld replied to a question at a news briefing by saying, "There are known knowns, there are things we know that we know. We also know that there are known unknowns. That is to say, there are some things that we know that we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones that we don't know that we don't know. And it's this latter category that tend to be the difficult ones." Rumsfeld's comments were about the Iraq War, but they're equally true of international real estate. Just to give you a few of the many possible examples of some of the many possible surprises that you might be encountering as an international real estate buyer, if you buy a home in Phuket, there's a very good chance you're going to have to pay extra for water because there is a chronic water shortage in Phuket and you have to pay to have a truck come along to deliver drinking water. If you buy a home in the UK, you could be responsible for paying for the upkeep of your local church under an ancient doctrine called chancel repair. In one recent case, which took 17 years to wrap up, a homeowner had to come up with £200,000 in fees. In the United States, the area 100 miles from the Canadian and Mexican borders is subject to the Department of Homeland Security's internal checkpoints, and Americans living or traveling through this border zone can be subjected to motor vehicle stops and what the Cato Institute calls constitutionally dubious searches. Willie Nelson got popped for having marijuana in his tour bus in one of these zones. You can never eliminate all the surprises, but you can improve your odds by reading the local newspaper, by talking to people who live in the area, and by renting before you buy. You can also hire somebody to do the research for you if you don't have time to do it yourself. So to recap, before you write off your city as too expensive, do some research. Investigate your local options in terms of size, age, and location, and your ability to repay a mortgage. With this information, you'll be able to recognize and act on a bargain and take advantage of a market dip should one of these occur. Second, consider substituting a smaller rental unit, a commercial or industrial property for your dream home. You can also hedge against rising home prices with real estate investment trust, mutual funds, or shares. Third, buy in a different state or province or an entirely different country. If you buy internationally, ensure that you know what you're purchasing, and if you can, buy land. Investigate financing before you commit to anything, and ensure that you understand your legal rights and obligations. Finally, learn about local issues by talking to owners, reading a local paper, and renting before you buy. You can also email me for a free 127-point buyer's checklist that covers buildings, land, title, developers, overseas and off-the-plan purchases, income and recreational property, and a whole bunch more. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. And now I'd like to open the floor to your questions.
Thank you very much, Christopher, and we welcome questions from the floor, so please prepare your thoughts. Well, maybe I can kick off. You mentioned you've seen 4 corrections in your time,
Yeah.
and you spoke about the risk of known unknowns and the like. One obvious question that comes to mind, given the city we live in, is that Hong Kong is overdue a correction of some kind. What's your own view on where Hong Kong is in that cycle, given what's happening in the broader global macro backdrop?
I hate to hedge, but I'm going to have to, because we live in a time without precedent here in Hong Kong. We have the rise of the Chinese middle class. We have an enormous amount of wealth coming across the border. Hong Kong is a very desirable place to live, and these factors have never come together at one time. I agree with you. I think Hong Kong is due, or perhaps even overdue, for correction. It is incredibly expensive to live here. Young people are very frustrated because they can't get on the property ladder. What's going to trigger that is anybody's guess. I would say the one obvious thing would be is if the mainland authorities turned off the taps and made it harder for mainland people to move here, and made it harder for mainland people to move their money here. And I don't know if you've seen this, if you've been through the airport recently, there are ads about currency controls here now, where you're not allowed to bring, I think, more than 120,000 Hong Kong dollars in cash across the border. So.
And the rising interest rates, is that not a more obvious or pressing problem?
Possibly. When we went through the Asian financial crisis in 1997, the default rate here was insignificant. People in Hong Kong pay their mortgages down, to the point where when I lived in Calgary, I heard for the first time a phrase called jingle mail, which is where you mail the keys back to the mortgage company. And that's just not something that you see, here in Hong Kong. People tend to pay their mortgages even if it's to the exclusion of other things. So now, if we're talking about 21% interest rates, all bets are off, obviously.
Sure. Okay, opportunity for the floor. If you have a question, please do raise your hand. Take one here. Please say your name and organization.
Yeah, Peter Kwong, Alpha Group. Actually, just a couple comments, not necessarily questions, but I came from Calgary as well.
Okay.
Well, about the same time as you were, and back in bought in Roxborough.
Okay.
I'm sure you know where that is. But having said that, the Asians are particularly like real estate, but
Yes.
not necessarily Europeans. Like, for example, Polish people, they do not like real estate. I mean, I've got friends who are living in Warsaw, and they say, why do you want to buy real estate? They say, they hide the, they have the gold underneath the table, and in case the Russians come and the German comes, sorry about Germans. No, never football. That they can run. So I think Asians are particularly like the real estates. But my question is, I guess you mentioned about the interest rate. I think the bubble. I think the whole world is in a bubble.
Very much.
Not only Hong Kong, but look at Vancouver, look at London, look at Sydney, look at Singapore, Manhattan, New York, or Toronto.
Very true.
So
Very true.
so it's going to. I wasn't going to say the word B-U-R-S-T, but.
Yeah, and, Peter, you raise a really, really good point. And one of the problems that we see in places like Hong Kong, but also in Canadian cities like Vancouver or Toronto, is the value of people's homes has just gone absolutely crazy. So that you have the wealth effect, right? So the house next to mine sold last year for $500,000 more than I think my home is worth now. So now I have the wealth effect. I think I'm $500,000 richer. So I start using my home as an ATM, and I start taking out second mortgages, home equity loans, that sort of thing. And part of that problem, when it gets worse, is that you have a one asset retirement strategy. All of the person's wealth is tied up in a home.
Exactly.
And if the property market corrects, they're screwed, especially if they've been taking out
Happened
second
before.
mortgages. Yeah, absolutely correct. Absolutely correct.
I remember the Calgary. I mean, the petrol. You mentioned about 21%.
Yeah.
I've seen property. Well, these are oil and gas properties that they have sold, a dime for a dollar, a dollar for a dime. So that happened before in other assets that I've actually seen.
And that's, people also assume that they're going to be able to sell as easily on the way down as on the way up.
Not true. Not true. It's like when you're in a theater, jam-packed with people, and someone yell fire. Normally you can escape through, but if you're 100 people going through one exit, a lot of people is going to get killed. So be cautious. That's what. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions from the floor? We have one here. You can just, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Chris. Yesterday, I looked at a chart on Vancouver property sale. It takes about 21 days once it's listed. Is there such a number for Hong Kong property getting listed? Is there a
You mean days on market?
Days on market, yeah.
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of. One of the things that Hong Kong has got going for it in some respects is it's very transparent. You can get the abstract from a piece of property. You can see all the mortgages on it. You can see who bought it and how much they paid for it, which is a huge improvement on many markets. But I don't think that's a statistic that's available. We're also, one of the other trends that's coming along in the real estate industry just globally is disruption of realtors or real estate agents' ability to monopolize transactions. And there's increasingly more and better data coming out there. So if you're the sort of person who wants to do some research and actually find out where you are on the cycle, how long something has been listed, in Canada what they do is they'll put it on the market, pull it off for a while, and then relist it, so that the data that you're seeing is not entirely reliable, shall we say.
Yep, in the middle, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. My name is John Antweiler. I'm retired. I have two questions. The first question is if you could comment on what you think the likely impact will be of the pending legislation here in Hong Kong relative to vacant flats.
Okay.
The second question is something that's sort of interested me, but I'm not a buyer, is the market for ghost houses. That is, homes where people have committed suicide, or there have been murders or that sort of thing. It seems like that's sort of a market now that people are saying, I don't care.
You're a
Give me
man.
that.
You're a man after my own heart. I'm a value investor. My idea of a good time is following the captain of the Exxon Valdez around. So, ghost houses and things like that. I totally get it. So, let me answer your first question first. The vacant homes tax is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It changes nothing and is purely cosmetic. It's a waste. It's a publicity stunt. If you wanted to actually do something to relieve the housing crisis here, if in fact there is a housing crisis, which is a whole nother discussion, there's all kinds of land available in the new territories. There is space on Lantau next to Disney. There is industrial space. There is no shortage of land in Hong Kong. What there is a shortage of political will. And until that happens, nothing is going to change. And I would say, just to close that thought off, when you have 150 people coming to Hong Kong every day, 50,000 a year, that is going to put incredible amounts of pressure on Hong Kong's most vulnerable and poorest people, the people who are collecting aluminum cans and you know, scrap cardboard and things like that. That's criminal. Something needs to be done about that. And nothing is going to get done to fix our housing problem until somebody is willing to grasp the nettle and start making some difficult but very necessary choices. As far as the ghost houses go, like I said, I love a bargain. And if you are going to buy something like that, you need to take a bit of a step back. One strategy is to buy something like that and rent it out to Guilos, because Guilos generally don't care, and it's fair enough. You also, you know, there's different ways of looking at that, though. So, for example, if you were a Guilo and you were married to a Chinese person, maybe your in-laws wouldn't want to come over and visit you if they knew about the house. Now, that could be a bug or a feature, depending on your perspective. But I have two very good friends who lived in an apartment in Parkview for a great many years, who got concessionary rents as a result of that. My wife and I overlook a cemetery in Pak Volam, and we've never really been bothered by the inhabitants thereof. During no, that's my children sneaking out. Now, the only time that the cemeteries in Hong Kong become a problem, and in all seriousness, is during the grave sweeping festivals, because then you have, where we are in Pak Volam, incredible traffic jams. I mean, they've just opened a 40,000 niche columbarium on Victoria Road, and that's going to. There are parts of the pavement, the sidewalk in Victoria Road, that's less than a meter wide, and it's going to be chaos, the next grave sweeping festival. So if you are going to be, you know, you need to sort of think a little bit outside the box and look at the totality of it, and also who you're going to sell it to. Now, if prices go high enough, nobody cares. And if the price is low enough.
Any more questions from the floor? This is your last opportunity. Yeah, one down the end, please.
My name is Shirley, and I'm just wondering, like, you know, if you were to place your bet, where would you place your bet now around the globe? It doesn't matter if it's be Hong Kong, UK, Australia.
So as I was explaining a moment ago, I like value investing. So I like things that are out of favor that I think are going to come back. Japan has been a very good investment there. I started investing there in 2010 when basically nobody wanted it. I think Japan still has got potential, particularly if you know what and where you're buying. Buying in rural Japan, I wouldn't touch that with your money. But buying in small apartments, fully depreciated in central Tokyo, I think there's still a great deal of opportunity there, despite the fact that prices have risen. Yields are still twice or three times what you can get on rental residential property here in Hong Kong. But you have to know what you're doing, and you have to do some research.
It's Ed Chin from the Press Freedom Committee at FCC. Now, talking about Japan, what about the new rule on, which is like the Airbnb type? There's a restriction for renting out 180 days. Some people say it's because it's targeting terrorists. The Tokyo Olympics coming up, and can you comment on that?
Absolutely. So on June the 15th, a brand new minpaku, which is what the Japanese call home sharing law, came into effect. And the number of hosts went from 62,000 to 2,700, basically overnight. When the Japanese brought in this new law, they did it in a very Japanese fashion, which is they said, well, you can continue to use Airbnb, but we're going to make you jump through so many burning hoops that if you want to do it legally, it's all but impossible to do so. Airbnb is hugely popular. I have one friend there who's got 300 apartments that he's renting out, and was getting very, very good returns on them. The Japanese government has mishandled it. And you can quote me on that. They canceled people's reservations. So people were showing up in Tokyo thinking that they had an Airbnb reservation, and they didn't. And there's a very good case to be made for if they don't smarten up with the way that the new law is managed, which is to say relax it, it's going to dampen or perhaps even kill the tourism boom that they've been enjoying. I should add also that the law that I mentioned that was put in place on the 15th of June is a national law. And there's also city and prefectural laws all over Japan. So for example, in Shinjuku, which is one of the major wards of Tokyo, you can't rent out Airbnbs from Monday to Thursday. And Kyoto, Katakawa-san, who's the mayor of Kyoto, has got a Jones for the Airbnb business like you wouldn't believe. He has set up a hotline where you can turn in your neighbors if they're doing Airbnb. It's just... it's absolutely brutal. Airbnb isn't for every tourist, but it fulfills a niche in Japan, which does have an accommodation shortage, and for some people who want a genuine Japanese experience, it can be a very valuable and useful experience. So I expect the Japanese are probably going to have to dial back some of that legislation when they start seeing the tourism numbers drop.
Yep, just here, please.
I'd like to follow on that question. Other areas around the world that have the same restrictions?
You raise a really good point, because Airbnb is not a Japanese problem. Airbnb is a global problem. The Japanese ones have just made it sort of insane. They're basically making Japanese Airbnb hosts compete with hotels. So for example, you've got to go to your local 7-Eleven and get the keys, or one hotel chain is actually offering a check-in service for local Airbnb staff. But you've got to be within something ridiculous like 100 meters of your home within all times if there's an Airbnb, if it's being used as an Airbnb. And it's basically just layer upon layer upon layer of unattainable regulations. For the record, I'm not blindly in favor of Airbnb, and I completely understand and respect people's concerns about having strangers walking through the halls, and the Japanese have a particular thing about strangers throwing wild parties, and the gravest of all sins in Japan, not sorting your garbage properly. I mean, that's beyond the pale. So it is a global problem, and it is something that's going to have to be resolved.
Do you know of any other places that have restrictions like that?
Oh, all over the world. Oh, yeah. It's increasingly it's becoming the exception rather than the rule. And the more popular a city is as a tourist destination, the more likely, like places like Paris, for example, is a classic example. Also, because the hoteliers have a genuine complaint, which is they have to invest in staff training, fire and safety, all of the bits and pieces that go along with that, and your Airbnb, generally speaking, doesn't. So.
Raise rents as well. In some of the
Yes, absolutely right. Yes.
Okay, so we're close to time now. Unless there are any other questions, could I just ask you all to thank Christopher for coming along today and giving us your time. Thank you.